and welcome to Depth Insights. This is the show where we take a depth psychological look at news, topics, and events that are going on in your world. I'm your host, Bonnie Bright, and I'm also the founder of Depth Psychology Alliance, which is an online academic community for those who are interested and active in the field of depth and Jungian psychologies. And my guest today is Thom Cavalli, who is a clinical psychologist, and he has a specialization in Jungian topics. And among other things, he's the author of Alchemical Psychology, Old Recipes for Living in a New World. And that's a book that I've had personally on my shelf since the early days of my interest in depth psychology. Thom also has a brand new book, which is called Embodying Osiris, The Secrets of Alchemical Transformation. And we're going to talk about that in just a bit. But meanwhile, Thom, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here with me.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's good to be here.
I wanted to just jump in and talk about some topics I know are near and dear to your heart, particularly in light of the books that you have written. But I wonder if you would kick us off by talking, first of all, about what alchemy is and why it's relevant to all of us.
Well, as many of your listeners may be aware, alchemy occupied the last 30 years of Jung's life. He put tremendous effort into researching that. I think that was a great way to bring alchemy into the sphere of psychology. But it didn't stop there. I think that alchemy, as we generally know it, is the transmutation of lead, an inferior metal, into gold. Of course, psychologically, we take that more metaphorically to mean dealing with such things as our shadow and transforming them into more golden material, meaning higher levels of consciousness.
Right, and that was something that, yes, as you mentioned, Jung took a definite interest in. And I don't know that Jung actually ever was able to write about direct experience with it, but I do know for a fact that you have had quite a bit of experience with Egypt. And I wondered if you would tell us a little bit about, just speaking from your own experience, what kind of influence Egypt as the birthplace of alchemy really has had on you, and maybe just some of the value that the ancient myths can bring forward.
Well, to begin with, in fact, Jung did travel throughout all of North Africa, and that did include Egypt. The influence it's had on me, not just Egypt, but Jung as well, has truly been life-transforming. It's given me a paradigm that helps me not just in my therapeutic work, which occupies most of my time, my writing, my lecturing, but most importantly, my personal life. I mean, it's a lens through which I look at life and see the potential for growth, because there are the seeds latent within everything that by bringing consciousness to them, we can bring both ourselves as well as the world that we live in to a much higher plane.
Yes, definitely. You know, I feel really lucky because I had the opportunity myself to travel to Egypt, just over a year ago, I guess. And what I was really struck by was not only just the feeling of ancient story that just kind of engulfs you on all sides as you start to visit some of these sites and just see miles and miles of hieroglyphs all along the walls around you. And also just the archetypal themes that seem to really be embodied within the landscape itself. This has really had a powerful impact on me. And of course, it's really hard to miss the Nile, which is one of the biggest archetypal images.
Yes, well, as it's been said before, well before us, if there weren't the Nile, there wouldn't be Egypt. What's fascinating in my travels throughout Egypt is what you described, but to kind of bridge it to where we are today, there is, all of these incredible gods that are etched into the walls and beautiful paintings. They aren't gods that we would think are very much alive today, and we certainly don't venerate them. However, in my studies and in my writing and in my lecturing, what I point out is that over the course of 5,000 years, there's been a great, what we call, introjection of the gods. And what we find is not just in mythology the evolution of particular gods, Osiris included, but that where in about 1 A.D., many writers were complaining that the gods had disappeared. What they didn't realize, because they didn't have modern psychology or they didn't have a Jung, is that these gods transformed into archetypes. So the archetypes are all within us, and all these gods, as I point out in my book, really are the dynamic entities which really went into the infrastructure of the modern-day psyche.
Absolutely. I love the way that you describe that. It's a very concrete way to really begin to understand how these forces are at work within us. Why don't you share with us a little bit about the theme of Embodying Osiris and how that does that 5,000-year-old story?
There are very many books written about Osiris, but I think what makes mine a very unique attempt to understand this myth is, number one, it's a Jungian interpretation, but more particularly, it lends an alchemical interpretation to the myth of Osiris, which was really a principal theme throughout all of the dynastic rule. What I discovered, and really what excited me, was that I was realizing that if you take a look at what most people know about the myth, and that is the death and dismemberment, the reanimation, and ultimately the resurrection of Osiris, that if you really kind of step back from that, what you realize is that this is a mythical way of portraying the central recipe of all of alchemical experimentation, which is simply salve et coagula, which is the Latin meaning dissolve and unite, or separate and unite. And really, it really is the recipe of life, and there are any number of ways to define that as a principle that underlies all of life itself, life and death, the conscious and the unconscious. What I do in the book is to bring it to life is use many of my patients' dreams, particularly ones that have a dismemberment theme within them, as well as synchronistic events that have happened mostly within my consultation room to illustrate the seminal formation of the modern psyche. I don't believe that Jung, for as much a genius as he was, I think he kind of got stuck in the medieval times to support his theory of individuation. I think with his genius, had he gone a step further and paid more deeper attention than he did to ancient Egypt and early Egyptian history, what he would have discovered is what I call in the book collective individuation and the development ultimately of monotheism. This is where there was a separatio, a division between the individual from the state. And I talk about this in terms of the radical pharaoh Akhenaten. The book is really quite an adventure story. It goes way beyond just telling the myth. There are maps, exercises, chronologies, even a legend describing the principal gods. It's fun to read, and by the reception I've gotten from my readers, it's an exciting read.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit. Maybe that's a great way to just launch into the next segment.
Yeah.
And just share some of your impressions of what's going on and how that relates to the work that you've been doing.
You know, this is a profoundly exciting time, one that I don't think that even most Americans can appreciate. I heard it recently from an Arab commentator that in the Middle East, Egypt is not even thought of. Egypt is so big in its prominence in the Middle East. He says it's more than a country. He considered it a planet, all its own. But in any event, what I'd like to do is connect this revolution that has inspired a cry out for freedom, within the last month or so, and this 5,000-year-old myth of Osiris. Most people, what they may know about the Osiris myth is really the first part, where it brings us up to the point at which Osiris is killed by his brother Seth, and Isis, his wife, reassembles and reanimates and has coitus with her deceased husband and bears a child named Horus. The second part of the myth, which I think bears direct relevance to what's going on in Egypt, is devoted to the question, who will inherit the throne of the now dead and resurrected Osiris? Will it be Set, the uncle, the brother of Osiris, or will it be his son Horus? And this really occupies the second portion of the myth. Now, we have to understand just very briefly the nature of these two gods. Seth is more than a murderer. He represents the desert regions. He represents an instinctual force, whereas Horus represents a civil rule of law. And this is the great contest that takes place, and ultimately, I'm not giving too much away, Horus does inherit the throne. But in reality, every government needs really some amount of both. They need the instinctive strength of a set, as in what the military is providing right now, but it also needs the cooling waters, if you will, of Horus. So this is the big contest that took place 5,000 years ago, and really throughout much of pharaonic rule for 3,000 years. You can actually see in King's List the alternation between pharaohs reigning and then military men stepping in, etc. And that's really what is being staged now in Cairo. The first step has been taken with the resignation of Mubarak, who, of course, had the reins of an autocratic government. But that really was just the first step. And the first step really in these kinds of revolutionary situations is, in the medieval ages, you would hear the king must die. An alchemical version of that is the king must die in order for the son to be born. In the Book of the Dead, that's said a different way. It said Osiris is yesterday, Horus is tomorrow. Just to put it very succinctly, what's being played out is that the dynamics between change on an egoistic level. In other words, is it strength that will take control, or will it be a more civilized democratic rule as represented by Horus, or whoever the incarnation of Horus might be? But really, I think what's being missed and what is really, really exciting is that, and to put it in Jungian terms, there's a transcendent function at work. And that, in other words, more than operating on the ego level, how do we transform? How do we envision or go beyond just this egoistic duality, and what form will that take? Very exciting question that's being questioned by many different factions of the people who, brought down essentially the government. But there are many, many challenges that are facing these people if they are to realize this dream that I'm referring to.
Absolutely. This just what you're describing elicits so many images for me, and I'm thinking, first of all, you had mentioned the key theme of the Osiris story is the death and the dismemberment. And then, of course, he is put back together by Isis, as you mentioned. And so it's bringing to mind all kinds of shamanic images, because that's really an archetypal image in the shamanic process, where often the shaman is dismembered, and then when he is reassembled, he is something other than what he or she was before. He's no longer that same entity, but there is some kind of transcendence that has taken place that typically is his own empowerment as the shaman. And so when we start looking at Egypt in the same way and start, comparing the two forces that you mentioned, the instinctive strength of Set and then the cooling waters and the civilized, more democratic process that comes really from the Horus archetype, it's interesting to see how those interplay with each other. Someone on the Alliance mentioned recently how she was looking at these images of the protesters and those who were really creating this revolution, is what I like to call it, even though it may not fit the textbook description. The image of these people, young people particularly, who were mostly using cell phones, and then there was a time when briefly they were attacked by men or soldiers who were riding in on horseback and camel, and she was really referring to the contrast between these two images, one that's almost this image of the future and that kind of a transcendent image, and one that just really seemed centuries old, riding in from another century. So I find that very interesting and also very alchemical, frankly.
Yes. Well, there's a theme, and I think it's on the dollar bill, e pluribus unum, and it means essentially in alchemy it's the one and the many. And that's the great paradox that has to happen. There needs to be a kind of a coalescence. And now I'm not even talking about the government. I'm talking about the people who, sparked this rebellion. And unless they can, coalesce into some kind of single voice, this whole revolution can backfire with absolutely dire consequences. So in other words, going back to that formula, salve et coagula, the separation that rend the people from the government is now splintering, even within these smaller factions. And there needs to be, and I'm using alchemical terms here, but there needs to be a coagulation. In other words, those voices have got to find a common voice. Because this is not just happening in Egypt. As we're seeing, there's a contagion factor that's spreading, throughout the Middle East. And we don't hear very much, interestingly enough, from Al-Qaeda. Because, the question is, and even President Obama has spoken to this point, but if the Egyptian people are able to really solidify this revolution, revise their constitution, have a representative government, et cetera, then you've had a bloodless revolution, thereby bringing into question, well, why do you need terrorism? Why do you need an organization like Al-Qaeda? Because Al-Qaeda is based on Islamic militarism. Well, there's no need for that if the Egyptian people right now succeed. So there's, a lot at stake. We might even consider Al-Qaeda as a kind of another image representing the forces of Seth. So, yes, you're right, and so was Mubarak right, actually, when he said, if I step down, there will be chaos. And, that sounds like a threat, but actually there was more truth in those words than one might imagine, because what we're seeing is a kind of a chaotic chain reaction throughout many of the Middle Eastern countries. But chaos isn't necessarily a negative thing, because it's only through chaos can a new order emerge. And that's what the hopes and prayers are of people who are fighting this battle, who are on the front lines. But I think that there needs to be one other factor that I haven't seen yet, and that is, and again, we resort to myth, but there needs to be a hero or a heroine. But there needs to be somebody who can carry this light. In the Egyptian cosmology, it would be carry the light or the sun of consciousness through the duat. The duat is the underworld, or what we would call the unconscious. So the creative energies have to have a hero to bring that light, to bring the sunlight, to bring it into a form. When I'm working with patients, when we're doing dream analysis, it isn't enough for us to sit and analyze the meaning of a dream. Because my last question is, okay, well, what form is that going to take in your life? When you step out of the consultation room and back into the quote-unquote real world, how are you going to be any different? And that's where alchemy is very special. In other words, how does it manifest in your life in the real world? So whether it's operating on an individual or a collective level, this really what alchemy strives to do, and why I think that alchemy is one of the most perfect metaphors for what's going on in the world, not just politically, but in medicine and religion and so many other different areas.
Absolutely. It seems like it's so connected to this idea of embodiment and bringing something into the physical world. And, of course, alchemy, we talk about working with the prima materia, or the very raw part of ourselves that has not been worked on, and then it gradually becomes processed over time and through all of our life experiences and everything that we encounter.
Yes.
But it remains a process, I would assume, that is very alive for you, that actually is manifest out into the world and interacts with things that are around us. Would you agree with that?
Oh my God, absolutely, yes. I see alchemy, although the word, is archaic, and there are new words in the modern idiom that will replace that word. We're not going to be talking about Osiris or alchemy for that matter. But, if you trace, for example, the evolution of Osiris through Serapis and Dionysus and Jesus, and ultimately even into Middle Ages, you have the Green Man. These are all archetypal images of that one God who is now an archetype. Well, is it any great surprise that the very God who is portrayed in one of two colors, either black or green, is the same color of what we now call the Green Revolution? That to me is not accidental, all right, for all of the associations we have with green, revolution. And what I talk about in the book is that basically Osiris goes through kind of like three incarnations. The first one is a nature spirit. The second one, he becomes god of the dead. But the third one that is often lost, he's the god of regeneration. And doesn't that describe basically what the Green Revolution is about and what genetic research is all about? And so, when we talk about embodying this spirit, we're trying to embody what I would think is the very impulse of life. And, that's not just a poetic phrase. I mean, when we're talking about stem cell research, and we're talking about what's been called the next stage of evolution, Homo evolutus, where man and woman really have the gift of the gods to design and redesign their own physical being as well as the material world. I mean, this is not just waxing poetics. I like to, if I may, I'm just going to read just one sentence just from Jung that speaks to embodiment. It's actually the head quote from my book. The decisive question for man is he related to something infinite or not? In the final analysis, we count for something only because of the essential we embody, and if we do not embody that, life is wasted. That, to me, captures a great deal of what's going on in the world and certainly within my own personal life. We are wrapped around infinity, but how do we manifest it in the world?
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's always been one of my favorite quotes, and I think it's behind a lot of my own motivation for just bringing depth psychology forward into the world. And I really love your description of this because I had never really extended alchemy beyond what I know it to be, which is a way of looking at more of a spiritual practice on a personal level, a way of individuating as Jung looked at it, but also to extend the metaphor into science and technology. And again, this image of seeing the value of technology, of people on their cell phones using social media and Twitter and the various technologies that are now available to us. This has played such a critical role in this particular event in Egypt. And so I think this idea of regeneration, the green, also carries over to that. And so it will be very interesting to see how that particular aspect shapes up in the myth that's unfolding in front of us.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I think that, technology is what do they call it, net neutral. I think it's what we do with the devices. It's just another form of anima, anima in the sense of relating. It's just a different form. I take a monthly stroll with my friend, an analyst, and he asked me, so what do you think about these e-books and these new types of phones and what have you? And I'll say to you and your audience what I said to him. It's just another access point. It's another window onto the world. So I'm all in favor of that because really what it represents is a new way that you and I, even in this conversation, would otherwise not be able to communicate. So I'm all for communication. If it's a beginning step to relating, I'm bringing more anima, more of the feminine into the world. Because there's a word for that, and that word is love.
Beautiful.
And in the last chapter of my first book, Alchemical Psychology, is essentially what I say. I trace really what is alchemy, not just as a spiritual practice, but also what does it look like in psychological forms? What is its methodology? And I talk to that. What do the elements mean in our psychological life? But ultimately, in the last chapter, I say, despite all of that, we already know what alchemy is. And if we had to reduce it down to one word, it's love. But it's not love in a kind of a poetic sense. Alchemy is that's what's fascinating about alchemy because it really takes place in the world of the psychoid dimension. So that there's some part of it that is spiritual, but there's some part of it that's also physical. And it's that integration that defines who we are, what our human nature is all about. And that is actually brought out in the cosmology that leads up to the Osiris myth when Geb and Nut, the gods of earth and the gods of sky, are initially one being, but they're pulled apart by their father, Shu, who represents the atmosphere. But in their separation, in their separatio, they leave some amount of their essence in the other. What opens up then is a space, a habitable space for human beings to live in and raise the prima materia to the philosopher's stone. But they have in potentia all of the contents of what's left to them by the essences of their father and their mother, the sky and all that it represents, the heavens, the spiritual, the mens, the mental, etc., and the earth, which is Geb. So we have all of the material, the prima materia, but we have to bring consciousness to it, and we know that consciousness is a potentiating and kinetic power from quantum physics. Just bringing conscious awareness to something changes its behavior. And ultimately, if we continue to bring consciousness to something, we raise it to a level of meaning, and only with meaning do we have choice and purpose in our lives.
Right, which brings us back to the Jung quote, are we related to something that's significant or not?
Yes, yes.
Well, Thom, thank you so much. This has been just so interesting.
Well, thank you for having me on the show, and I just want to congratulate you for putting this incredible site together.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's been my pleasure, for sure, and happy to have you as an active and participating member as well. I'd like to make sure that people know where to find you and know about the book. You currently have a website. Actually, first of all, people can find you online on Facebook at Thom Cavalli, and it's spelled ThomCavalli. And your website is cavallibooks.com or alchemicalpsychology.com. And, of course, we're talking about the book Embodying Osiris, which can be found at Amazon or any of the major resellers. I know that you do have a couple of upcoming events. Would you like to share with us what's going on in your calendar? And that way anyone in the area will have the benefit of being able to...
Oh, yeah. Thank you for asking. Yeah, I've got a couple of things coming up that should be a lot of fun. In my local area is Chapman University, and the Orange County Jung Club, which has been one of the largest Jung societies ever. They put on exciting programs. And on April 17th, I will be talking about the Osiris myth, going through the entire myth and its meaning for us today. For more information, go to jungianoc.org. And then, and this I really want to promote because it is like going to the circus. It is amazing. This year, the International Alchemy Conference will be September 16th to the 18th, and it's going to be held at the Long Beach Convention Center. I will be a keynote speaker. I will be doing some really far-out workshop. We will literally be dying and transforming in that workshop. For more information on that, you can either go to my website, cavallibooks.com, or go directly to www.alchemyconference.com. The one other thing I would like to mention is a little-known but wonderful journal called Alchemy Journal. It is the most beautiful journal that I've ever seen. It has incredible articles, not the least of which is I will have the lead article on ancient Egypt in their next edition. So those are the things I would just like to mention. For people who want to keep up with my schedule, just go to my website, cavallibooks.com. Alchemical Psychology is also a website, only there you'll find more information, not just about me, but about the rudiments of alchemy. So if you want to learn more about that, that's a good place to go.
Wonderful. Well, congratulations on all that you have going on, and certainly I'm very grateful to be able to learn more from you, and I look forward to, you've got me intrigued about the Alchemy Conference, I have to admit, so I might have to show up there and have a look. Thank you so much, Thom. I really appreciate your time.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome, and thank you for having me. I look forward to doing this again.